It seems like 2024 has been a bit of a stagnant year when it comes to home arcade releases. Now, I know there's some companies who are slowly coming out with newer content and newer devices, but it seems like a lot of those won't be happening until 2025. And of course, with Arcade 1UP, it's felt like a bit of a drought in terms of releases that I myself and others are actually interested in getting. And so I've been kind of on a hiatus when it comes to the general home arcade content that I typically touch on. However, recently I started looking at the Unico Visco arcade bar top that they released earlier this year, and I myself have warmed up a bit more to the countercades from Arcade 1UP, but they have a lot of issues in terms of not being able to play with a secondary player and oftentimes having a very limited game list. And when I saw that Unico was releasing this device, I was interested in two particular games. I really like Breakers Revenge, and I really enjoyed playing Neo Driftout way back when. So I figured, you know what, for a 12-game device and for only $200, I think this is worth taking the risk on. And in this video, I'm going to go over my experiences with this bar top machine and if it's worth purchasing or skipping entirely. So let's take a look. Just to start with the packaging itself, it looks relatively good. You can see some of the games on the side. However, as you start taking and opening up this box itself, you'll see that on the top there is a power adapter as well as an additional packing controller, which I'll get to that in a moment. Now, with the actual unit itself, as I pull it out here, one of the things that I was interested in was the actual size and form factor versus the Arcade 1UP branded countercades, for example, which would be kind of the closest type of device in this class. And putting it side by side with one of Arcade 1UP's more recent countercades, the Ninja Turtles one, you can see that the Unico Visco is just a bit bigger, which to me, I prefer. I like the size to this. It just looks more appealing in my opinion in my home arcade. And as far as the actual unit itself, however, one thing that I don't think that Unico Visco did as well with this machine versus the Arcade 1UP countercades is the way they put this artwork together. And it's not particularly the artwork itself that's the issue. I just really dislike how you have the arcade bar top listed at the bottom. I also, while I like the Visco marquee, and I especially like that it lights up, I don't like that they put 12 legendary games underneath. It just seems too busy. And I'm rarely a guy who complains much about the artwork on these machines, but it just makes this look almost like a Temu type product, not a commercial type of product like you'd get from Arcade 1UP, which to me, it's not a major detracting point, but it is something worth mentioning. Now, setting this thing up, you simply just plug it in, it's ready to go. And you have 12 games built into the device, and for the purpose of this review and what I've done for my testing on this, I myself mainly purchased this for Breakers Revenge and Neo Driftout. I did try a couple of the other games. In my opinion, some of these Visco games are not games that I was ultra interested in, nor can I tell you that I have some long fondness of them. But Breakers Revenge to me is a heavily underrated fighting game that I used to play on old MAME emulators way back when. And same with Neo Driftout. To me, those are some of the best Neo Geo releases, and it's cool to be able to play them here. And as far as the controls go, to start, I like the buttons. I think the buttons have a nice clickiness to them. I think they have a nice feel to them. The joystick itself feels pretty good. My dislike of it, however, is you can't take this ball top off and swap it out with a bat top, which to some people might be an issue. And for me, I prefer a bat top when it comes to fighting games, and I would have liked to have had the option to switch it out for that reason. So that's one knock. Now, I like, and I think it's cool that there's a coin button, but it would have been almost cooler if they did like a little coin door thing right beneath the control pad where you just press that and it does the coins itself there. Unfortunately, this this isn't the case, and that's what you have here. Now, one thing that I do want to highlight that I think is very interesting is one of my complaints about the arcade 1-up countercades and even some of the newer partycades comes down to the fact that there isn't an option for a secondary player. Not even the opportunity to plug in a USB device like you could with this Street Fighter 2 one on behind me. And to me, that's a feature that was sorely lacking, especially in the Ninja Turtles unit that I have from Arcade 1-Up. And I appreciate that Unico actually went ahead and solved that issue, and they gave you a pack-in controller, and you can use that as a secondary player. Now, it has a weird quirk to it, however. And what that quirk is if you plug this controller in, that controller assumes player 1, and player 2 will have to use the control pad and the joystick on the actual unit itself, which just seems like a weird switch up to me, as I would assume, like I did with my partycade back here, typically the second player would be using that secondary controller and the first player would be using the joystick and buttons on the control panel, but that's not the case here, and there doesn't appear to be an option setting where I can change that out, which just seemed a little weird to me. And further to that, while I sincerely appreciate that Unico had the foresight to include the secondary controller, the controller is, how do I say it? It feels very rigid, but not in a good way. While the thumb pad itself to me felt okay, the buttons themselves didn't really feel that great, and I found it hard to play a game like Neo Driftout or Breakers Revenge, especially with this type of gamepad. But I am happy to report that I did try my PlayStation Classic controller and a couple other USB controllers, and you can plug in other controllers and this device will recognize them. So it's not like you're stuck with this poorly made pack-in controller on the Unico if you are going to be using a secondary player. Now, of course, there's also the consideration that this is an 8-inch screen, so viewing angles might be a bit awkward trying to play with a secondary person. But I myself appreciate that this is an option and there is enough flexibility that you can do that. Now, going into the actual games themselves, every single game you can select an options for, and the options themselves control things like language, it controls things like volume, as well as scan lines, smoothing it out, or just playing it with essentially HD, upscaling or HD graphics essentially. And ultimately, all these settings, in my opinion, worked very well. Again, I primarily tested Breakers Revenge and Neo Driftout, and even with the other settings enabled, I didn't find that there was any emulation issues from my playtesting, which is great, especially with a game like Breakers Revenge, which moves relatively fast and is quite high-paced. So all of the emulation felt very good on this device. And for the most part, I enjoyed getting through a lot of the different games on this device, and other than the fact that I couldn't change out the joystick, I enjoyed playing with both the control panel and the joystick for the most part, although I couldn't use the Bartop, which kind of sucked. But I did enjoy playing these games, and they felt like they played good, they controlled good, and for the most part I felt like these buttons felt better than some of the Arcade 1-Up releases. While they're not perfect, they definitely had a nice feel to them, a nice click to them that you definitely don't get with some of even the Arcade 1-Up releases, which I felt that was pretty good. And the control panel itself, I also like that it has an integrated deck protector inside the actual control panel itself, which prevents it from, you know, getting wear and tear like we saw on some of the first generation Arcade 1-Up units, for example. One other thing I do want to highlight, though, that I think is a little off is the sound itself. You have to control it through the option setting, which to me, it works, but it seems a little annoying. I prefer Arcade 1-Up's model where you have your volume controls on the panel itself. The fact that you have to go to an option setting to change this to me was kind of lacking, and further to that, while you do have a dual speaker setup, there appears to be a bit of like a feedback buzzing noise that you get, and at higher volumes some of the games crackle a bit and they don't sound the greatest. Now, I myself am not a guy who nitpicks too hard on the sound settings like some people do with the Arcade 1-Up units, and I would argue that the sound here is acceptable. But for those of you who may find this a little, how do I say this, you may find this a little frustrating that it doesn't sound as crisp as it could, that might be a detracting point to even picking this up. And a couple other things I do want to also highlight is you do have some cool little extra features on this device, like being able to hook this up via HDMI, which I did not test. I've seen other reviewers test it, but you can hook this up to a TV if you'd like, which I think is a cool little add-on, as well as you can plug in headphones and those sorts of things to use this with, you know, a different speaker setup or headphones if that's something you choose to do. But overall, I myself am a person who prefers flexibility and options, and as it stands, I don't think this is a bad unit. However, there's a big asterisk there, and that comes down to the games. I like Breakers Revenge, I like Neo Driftout, so for 200 bucks, I feel like this device is worth it. I will try out more of these games a little deeper, but I'm gonna be straight up that I'm not gonna tell you I have a strong history with them or even know what some of these games are, and some of the ones I played to me kind of feel like throwaways for the Neo Geo. But if you like Breakers Revenge and you like Neo Driftout like I do, I think there's a lot to like with this device, and I think there's a lot of great flexibility with this device, despite the fact that it has some weird quirks that kind of hold it back from being perfect. But overall, for the $200 that I spent, I don't think this is a bad deal, and I think that there's a lot to love with this unit, especially if you're like me and you do like some of the old school Neo Geo releases like this.